Hey peeps, welcome back to the Majesty of Reason. I'm Joe Schmid, and today I'm responding to Cameron Bertuzzi's recent video entitled, Why, After a Decade of Study, I No Longer Take Atheism Seriously. So I'm first going to play the whole video with a little bit of commentary, and then I'll offer 4 in-depth responses to Cameron's case.
So roughly 13 years ago, my brother became an atheist. We were brought up non-denominational, evangelical Christians, so this came as quite a shock, as you might imagine. Now, I actually went through my own period of doubt right after high school, but I got over it pretty quickly. Like, I personally doubted whether or not Jesus actually existed, but I had those doubts overcome pretty quickly when I learned that Jesus was actually mentioned by non-Christian historians like Josephus. So after I learned that he became an atheist, I thought I could overcome his doubts pretty easily, but I was wrong. I was very, very wrong. What's up, everyone? Cam here. In this video, I'm telling you the story of how after 10 years of study, I no longer take atheism seriously.
So it's not exactly clear from his video what Cameron means by not taking atheism seriously. We can ask, does he mean that he doesn't think atheism is rationally defensible? Does he think that atheistic belief is irrational? Now, I don't think this is what Cameron has in mind, but if it is, I want to just play a clip from my video, Theism is rational, but Trent Horn is wrong, and that upsets me. Okay, with all that out of the way, let me say at the outset that yes, it's quite obvious that theism can be rational, and the same is true of atheism. I'm certainly not here to dispute Trent's case on that front. Whether someone is rational in believing something is a function of a huge concoction of individual specific factors, including their particular background, web of beliefs, the books they've read, the papers they've read, the videos they've watched, the podcasts they've listened to, the order in which they've read and listened to these things, the experiences they've had, their precise body of testimonial evidence, their plausibility structures or their intuitions, and countless other factors besides. This individual-specific mixture of factors situates each of us in a unique position on the grand epistemic landscape, equipping each of us with unique, sometimes incommunicable reasons for our beliefs. This also is how disagreeing parties can oftentimes each be rational. Right? The parties are coming equipped with different lenses through which they see the issue, different background reasons, and more besides. It's trivially easy to find people whose unique concoction of the aforementioned factors renders it rational for them to believe in God. And it's likewise trivially easy to find people whose unique concoction of the aforementioned factors renders it rational for them to disbelieve in God. This is partly why intellectual empathy is so important. It helps you to at least approximately see things from someone else's perspective and to appreciate the other person's rationality. In turn, this helps facilitate the productive, love-oriented exchange of ideas between you and the other person. So anyway, all of this is to say that one can definitely be rational in being a theist, just as one can definitely be rational in being an atheist. Of course, those agnostics are definitionally irrational, so no love for them. Now, here's what I think Cameron has in mind. I think he's basically saying that atheism is no longer a live option for Cameron. It's just too far outside the bounds of what he personally takes to be plausible and too disconfirmed by his own evidence and reasons to the point of not meriting serious, sustained consideration anymore in his personal inquiry. This is a more respectable interpretation since it doesn't imply any pronouncements about other people's evidence bases, so I'll stick with it going forward. My contention will be that in this sense, Cameron should still take atheism seriously, and you probably should too.
Now, I started this video telling you about my brother, and that's all very relevant to where I'm at now. I used to take atheism very, very seriously. But pretty much the only thing I knew about atheism back then was that a lot of really smart, like, scientists were atheists, right? I'd heard the name Richard Dawkins, but I didn't know what he actually said about religion. I just knew that really smart people were atheists. But let's return to the story, okay? After I learned that my brother became an atheist, I decided I was going to meet with him and like crush all of his objections. Okay. This ended up being like the worst idea that I could have come up with. My brother and I met, and it turned out to be literally like one of the worst nights of my life. He raised objections to Christianity I had never even dreamt of, but that night showed me that I really had no clue why I believed in Christianity. So after that night, I started to look into the arguments for and against God's existence. I wanted to know whether or not God's existence was actually reasonable. And after just a few weeks of study, I quickly learned that there are very powerful arguments for God's existence. I found the Kalam cosmological argument.
Check out my Kalam cosmological argument playlist, wherein I systematically examine every single nook and cranny of the Kalam cosmological argument, including stage 1 and stage 2, and both of the premises in the first stage, and the sub-arguments for both of those premises, etc. Sorry, every time someone says Kalam, I have multiple spasms and seizures. I can't help it.
Contingency arguments.
Check out my contingency arguments playlist.
Teleological arguments from fine-tuning.
Check out my design arguments playlist, wherein I talk about the fine-tuning argument.
Moral arguments.
Check out my moral arguments playlist as well.
Actually, a ton of arguments for the existence of God. Check out this video. Got it linked right here, in which we lay out over 150 arguments for God's existence that show up in the literature.
And also, of course, check out my 12 hours long video responding to those arguments, which also drew on published literature in response to the relevant arguments, including published literature of my own.
Might lead you to think that this kind of like settles the matter. Like, don't all of these arguments for God's existence prove that atheism is unreasonable? Well, not so fast. Okay, first of all, every single argument has responses from atheists, and you've kind of got to do the work going through those responses. But secondly, there are also powerful arguments for atheism. Now, the best argument that atheists have, at least that I've found, is the problem of evil. The problem of evil is so powerful, in fact, that it's led a lot of people to say, look, okay, sure, you've got arguments for the existence of God, but the problem of evil is so powerful that it defeats all of those arguments. But you know what? I should probably like pause the story really quickly and just explain what this argument is, just a little bit more in depth, because somewhat counterintuitively, it actually plays a central role in why I no longer take atheism seriously. So first, let me say that this is one of the arguments I've paid the most attention to over the past decade. I've read books, I've watched debates between top scholars, I've listened to lectures, I've watched Joe Schmid.
Well, that was your first mistake, Cameron.
So to quickly summarize, the problem of evil is an argument against an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God. There's a really common way that it's expressed these days. Premise 1, if God exists, pointless suffering does not exist. Premise 2, pointless suffering exists. Therefore, 3, conclusion, God does not exist. Both premises in this argument seem pretty plausible. Like if God did exist, he would probably not permit any pointless suffering. All suffering would have some kind of purpose. The Bible even says that God is working all things toward our good. So premise 1 seems pretty plausible. Premise 2 also seems pretty plausible. Like just look around a bit and you'll find cases of seemingly pointless suffering. Now, as you might expect, just like atheists have responses to the arguments for God's existence, Christians have responses to both premises and the argument from evil. Some Christians argue that God can allow pointless suffering. Others argue that while some suffering might seem pointless on the surface, it still nevertheless has a purpose. But that's not what I'm doing in this video. Like I wasn't convinced that atheism is silly because Christians have responses to these premises. The reason why I don't take atheism seriously any longer is because even if we accept the atheist's strongest argument, it still wouldn't prove atheism.
So again, with some of the language here, I think we need to be a little bit careful. Cameron has just talked about proof, and later on in the video, he talks about establishing atheism. It's not exactly clear what he means by proof. Oftentimes in these contexts, when we say proof, we mean something like demonstrate with certainty. Now, if that's what Cameron means, well then, sure, I don't think that these arguments prove atheism, but of course that's clearly a far too high standard, one that theism itself doesn't even meet. The only things that are going to meet this standard are, certain mathematical beliefs maybe, certain logical beliefs maybe, and possibly beliefs about one's immediate conscious experiences, such as the belief that I'm in pain right now, which in this case was true after watching Cameron's video. By contrast, if by proof Cameron means something like support, or raise the probability of, or provide some grounds for believing, well, that's a considerably lower bar, and it's one that I think can be met, as we'll see.
And now I'm kind of realizing that I probably should have defined atheism a lot earlier on. Well, philosophically, atheism is the view that there are no gods. It's very simple. There's no creator, there's no designer of the universe. We weren't created for some purpose by somebody.
So at least some of those were additional claims that atheists are not committed to. So he said something along the lines of, we weren't made for some purpose by somebody. It seems to me that atheists can perfectly well accept that we were made for some purpose by somebody. For instance, it seems like it's in principle open to an atheist to say that we live in a simulation, and there are these humanoid or human-like subjects who are simulating us for some purpose. In that case, we'd be made for some purpose, but it wouldn't follow that atheism is false. And that's because it seems like the simulators need not be divine. They need not be gods. Likewise, there's a very real sense in which if our universe is a simulated universe, then there are designers of our universe, namely the simulators in base reality. But again, they need not be God. So it seems like, at least here, Cameron is appending to atheism things that are not entailments of atheism, not part of atheism. And likewise, it seems like these beings are in some sense creators of our universe. But again, they need not thereby be gods.
Theism, on the other hand, is the view that at least one God exists. So atheism has no gods and theism has at least one God.
So here I'm happy to go along with Cameron's usage, but it is worth noting that theism in philosophy is polysemous. What Cameron provides is one perfectly legitimate usage of theism in the literature, but there are other perfectly legitimate usages that are also quite prevalent in the literature. For instance, one usage of theism does indeed just refer to the kind of traditional omnigod. That is a god which is omniscient, omnipotent, and morally perfect, or omnibenevolent. But again, going forward, I'm going to be following Cameron's definition here, and it is a perfectly legitimate definition of theism.
But so why doesn't the problem of evil establish atheism? Well, simply because there are many, many, many other kinds of gods that it doesn't rule out. The British philosopher Philip Goff is a really good example of someone that adopts a sort of non-standard view of God.
So we're in a situation where the believers are tying themselves up in knots trying to explain suffering. The atheists are trying to tie themselves up in knots trying to explain fine-tuning. When in fact, there are middle ground options that can elegantly account for both of these data points. Consider, for example, the hypothesis of a God of limited power. A God who's made the best universe they can. Maybe God simply can't create complex life in an instant. Maybe the only way God can create intelligent life is by creating a universe with the right physics that is eventually going to evolve intelligent life. And God's like, I'm sorry, I know it's going to be messy. This is all I can do, is this or nothing. I think this hypothesis can account for both the fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes and the suffering in terms of God's limitations.
So even though God is all good, perfectly benevolent on this view, given his limit in power, there's no way that he can stop all of the suffering in the world. What I want you to notice here, and this is really important, the problem of evil, which is, once again, one of the atheist best arguments, doesn't touch this particular view of God that we just went over. It doesn't touch it at all. Think about it like this. Okay, scientists used to believe that the speed of light was infinite. When we discovered evidence that the speed of light was finite instead of infinite, we didn't conclude that there's no such thing as light. Right? We modified our concept of the speed of light, one of the properties of light. So what I'm saying here is that the best case scenario for the atheist in this argument should really just lead us to revise our view of God. It shouldn't lead us to become atheists. Keep in mind, I'm not saying that the problem of evil is sound or persuasive. Personally, I think there are many good responses to the problem of evil, like the soul-building theodicy. I'm saying that even if we grant it, hypothetically, if we grant it, it doesn't come anywhere close to even establishing atheism. Something else important I want you to notice is that the same cannot be said of arguments for God's existence. If we grant that the arguments go through for God's existence, then they would actually prove that at least one God is real. So the move that I'm making here by hypothetically granting their argument is not available to the atheist. They can't hypothetically grant the arguments for theism. Instead, they just sort of have to trust that every argument for God's existence fails, even the ones they've never heard of, which is actually kind of a giant leap of faith if you think about it. All right, now just so I'm not misunderstood, here's what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that Christians should think that God is limited in power. I'm not saying that we have to make this move, okay? What I'm saying is that the atheist's best argument doesn't come close to establishing atheism. Not even close. So even if we grant the atheist's strongest argument, it does not support atheism. The most it would do, again, hypothetically, is cause us to revise our view of God. That's it. And this is a huge reason why I no longer take atheism seriously. I should also mention that this is just one reason why I no longer take atheism seriously. If you'd like to see more reasons, check out my recent live stream with David Wood, where we break down Alex O'Connor's embarrassing debate against Cliff Netchtel. So it appears that David Wood and I are actually in complete agreement on this, which is pretty cool. Oh, and then Christianity is true.
So I have 4 main responses to Cameron's case, and here is just an overview before I go into each of them in more depth. First, there are arguments worth taking seriously against all versions of theism. Second, limited God views face serious problems, so the rejection of them, in addition to the unlimited God of omnitheism, should be taken seriously. Third, atheistic arguments like the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, etc., can considerably decrease generic theism's probability, and this isn't changed by the fact that some versions of theism predict the data just as well as atheism or the most likely variants of atheism. And fourth, and finally, the same quote-unquote problem that Cameron identifies equally afflicts arguments for theism. And so, by Cameron's own reasoning, we also shouldn't take theism seriously. So first, there's still a wide variety of respectable atheistic arguments that target any version of theism and are defended by incredibly adept philosophers. And I think it's quite clear that these arguments are worth taking seriously. And it seems to me that if the arguments with the conclusion that God doesn't exist are worth taking seriously, or with the conclusion that we should reject theism are worth taking seriously, then it seems like the rejection of God's existence, any God's existence, is likewise worth taking seriously. And those, of course, are my only claims here, by the way. I'm about to articulate some arguments for global atheism, the denial of all gods, and I'm not here saying that those arguments succeed. I just think that they should clearly be taken seriously. But lo and behold, even with that caveat, the cringe commenters are still going to be on their way and still going to be saying, Joe accepts these arguments. Yeah, well, here's an objection. So take, for instance, Graham Oppy's argument in his book, The Best Argument Against God, which he also defends in his debate book with Kenny Pierce, Is There a God? In short, Oppy argues that certain fleshed-out versions of naturalism can explain all the relevant data just as well as theism, but is nevertheless simpler than theism, because theism posits a God in addition to the physical universe, and theoretically characterizes God or the gods in various ways, whereas Oppy's naturalism only posits the physical universe. And if two views explain the data just as well, and one is simpler than the other, we should reject the more complicated hypothesis, and hence we should conclude that theism is false. This argument doesn't just apply to an unlimited God, but also to any limited God. In other words, it just applies to theism simpliciter, or generic theism, the view that there is at least one God. Again, regardless of whether we think this style of argument works, I think it's pretty clear that it should be taken seriously. At least as someone who's published on these topics, and on Oppy's argument here in particular, I can tell you that it's definitely taken seriously in the literature and among most professional philosophers in my experience. But Oppy's argument isn't the only atheistic argument which targets theism more broadly, or generic theism. Lots of other arguments do too. In fact, for patrons who have access to this video's script, I include in the script a variant of Paul Draper's decisive evidence argument that Draper defends in his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on atheism and agnosticism, and more extensively in his forthcoming book with Oxford University Press, or at least I think it's with OUP. The variant in the script targets any version of theism, and, at least in my view, the argument is worth taking seriously. And there are many other arguments like this, as one can discover by glancing at Dr. Felipe Leon's list of over 200 arguments for atheism, or maybe more accurately, his list of arguments for local atheism, or disbelief in a particular god, in this case the omni-god, a number of which duly serve as arguments for global atheism, or disbelief in every god. For instance, arguably it's part of the concept of a god that it's an ultimate or foundational reality, and one of the arguments on Felipe's list is from metaphysical infinitism and metaphysical coherentism, for which there are various arguments in the metaphysics literature, and both of which are incompatible with there being an ultimate or foundational reality. And lots of other arguments on Felipe's list are like this. For example, arguments from rival non-theistic supernaturalistic views, positive arguments that conclude to the truth or likely truth of naturalism, which by many of the standard definitions of naturalism in the literature entails the truth or likely truth of global atheism, arguments that worship-worthiness is part of the concept of a god, but that nothing is worthy of worship, as in Scott Aiken's Problem of Worship paper here, and on and on and on. In fact, within the next few months, I'll be joining Emerson Green and Sebastian Montesinos for a presentation by Sebastian on a newly renovated post of his providing a cumulative case for atheism. Therein, he runs more than 10 separate arguments with many sub-arguments that appeal to a wide variety of data, both about priors and about evidence, many of which have little to nothing to do with the problem of evil, and many of which would challenge non-standard versions of theism, like Goff's, the one that Cameron mentions. So keep an eye out for that on Emerson Green's channel. Now, in light of the variety of arguments for global atheism worth taking seriously and defended by professional philosophers more philosophically capable than Cameron, I think it's pretty clear that Cameron should still take atheism seriously. On to my second response to Cameron, which is that limited God views face serious problems, and so the rejection of them, in addition to the unlimited God of omnitheism, should be taken seriously. There's a litany of problems for limited God hypotheses. And again, my point is that these problems are at least worth taking seriously. I'm actually not concerned here to argue that any of these problems are ultimately successful. My point is just that they're worth taking seriously, and you shouldn't infer that I automatically accept all the problems that I'll be articulating. And notably, if they are worth taking seriously, and if some of the hundreds of arguments against unlimited theism are also worth taking seriously, then global atheism should likewise be taken seriously. After all, the global atheist can first conclude that there's no unlimited God, and then use these and other problems to conclude that limited God hypotheses are likewise false. So here's the first problem that we're going to be covering for limited God hypotheses. The problem is that most prominent versions of limited God hypotheses are too imprecise to generate predictions, and hence too imprecise to assimilate the standard and most powerful pieces of evidence favoring omnitheism. Unlimited God hypotheses are often articulated in such a way that, for at least one of the triomni properties, God simply doesn't have that property. Instead, he's limited in that respect. But merely being told that God is limited in power, for instance, leaves us hopelessly in the dark about what his power level is, and hence about what he can and can't accomplish. This in turn leaves us considerably hampered in generating predictions. You could specify that he's still very powerful, but this too is extremely vague, and it monstrously hampers predictive power. Of course, a natural way to solve this problem is to specify some precise cutoff in level of power or level of knowledge or level of goodness, for instance, to specify what exactly God can and can't do in more detail. But that brings us to the second problem for limited God hypotheses, namely arbitrariness. As soon as you posit a specific cutoff in degree of power or knowledge or goodness or whatever, you're going to considerably lower the probability of your hypothesis by virtue of its significant arbitrariness. Why that cutoff specifically, as opposed to any of the countless conceivable other cutoffs? None of the cutoffs seem more natural or more principled or less arbitrary than the others, and so it seems like we should treat them equally in terms of the probability we assign to a God having any one of the cutoffs. But since there are vastly many such cutoffs, this means the prior probability of a limited God hypothesis that's sufficiently specific to enjoy predictive power is going to be extraordinarily small. In fact, limited God hypotheses might have vanishingly small prior probabilities. To see why, consider two theories. The no-limit theory says that the fundamental laws of physics apply everywhere in the universe. There is no limit to their application. By contrast, the limit theory says that the fundamental laws of physics apply everywhere in the universe except for some extremely tiny region at the outskirts of a galaxy on the outskirts of the observable universe. Now, most of us, including physicists, think that the no-limit theory is far more likely than the limit theory. But notice that our empirical evidence is about equally good for both of them. If there's just one astronomically small and far-out region governed by different equations or no equations at all, then it's overwhelmingly unlikely that we would have found it. And so our observations of the uniform applicability of the fundamental laws of physics are only overwhelmingly weak evidence for the no-limit theory over the limit theory. So then, if we really are justified in thinking the no-limit theory is far more probable than the limit theory, it's because of something about the no-limit theory compared to the limit theory prior to taking any empirical evidence into account, since the empirical evidence only negligibly favors the no-limit theory. In other words, the prior, or more accurately, intrinsic probability of the no-limit theory must be far greater than that of the limit theory. By the way, a prior probability of hypothesis is just the probability of the hypothesis prior to looking at a particular piece of evidence. The intrinsic probability of hypothesis is just the probability of the hypothesis prior to looking at any empirical evidence whatsoever. So again, the intrinsic probability of the no-limit theory, it seems, must be far greater than that of the limit theory. And that's plausibly for two reasons. First, the limit theory is extremely arbitrary in making a seemingly unprincipled exception to an otherwise unlimited application. And second, the very fact that the fundamental laws apply everywhere apart from the tiny exceptional region gives us strong inductive reason to think that the laws also apply to that region. And so the different components or conjuncts of the limit theory suffer from probabilistic tension. In other words, one of the parts of the theory gives us strong reason to think that another part of the theory is false. And this in turn drastically lowers the overall probability of the theory. This, incidentally, is the third problem for limited God hypotheses. They suffer from probabilistic tension. Notice also that, quite plausibly, even the general class of limit theories is still significantly less intrinsically probable than the no-limit theory. So not only does each individual limit theory suffer from an extremely low intrinsic probability, but so does the general class of limit theories. And the overarching point here in the second and third problems for limited God hypotheses is that the same lessons from the limit theory and no-limit theory seem to apply with full force to unlimited and limited God hypotheses. Limited God hypotheses, not only individually but collectively, suffer from a very low intrinsic probability. This is a very serious mark against these hypotheses from the outset, and it's not at all clear that they explain evil and hiddenness, etc. so well to recuperate their drastic probabilistic losses from the outset. At the very least, I think the view that they don't is worth taking seriously. Oh, also, another probabilistic tension afflicting most limited God hypotheses is that they posit a being with all sorts of great-making features or perfections held to their intrinsic maxima, or their, greatest extent, except for one or a select few great-making features, like power, which aren't held to their maximal extent. But the very fact that a being has all other maxed-out great-making features gives us inductive reason to think that it has all maxed-out great-making features. So, once again, most limited God hypotheses are going to suffer from still further probabilistic tension. The very fact that God has a lot of power gives us inductive reason to think that he has all power. So if you specify that he has a lot of power, but not all power, your hypothesis suffers from probabilistic tension. And moreover, these hypotheses often posit that all of God's other properties are great-making properties had to their maxed out extent, which also gives us strong inductive reason to think that this property, power in particular, is also a great-making feature had by God to a maxed out extent. And so any hypothesis which posits the former but rejects the latter is going to be suffering from probabilistic tension. Different parts of the hypothesis count against one another. There's a kind of internal conflict within the hypothesis. And if you're wondering kind of mathematically why it's a problem for a hypothesis that it suffers from probabilistic tension, theistic philosopher Robin Collins nicely explains. A hypothesis H suffers from probabilistic tension if and only if H is logically equivalent to some conjunctive hypothesis, H1 and H2, such that the probability of H1 given H2 is much less than 1. That is, one conjunct of the hypothesis is very unlikely conditional on the other conjunct. A hypothesis H suffering from probabilistic tension will be quite intrinsically unlikely, since the probability of H just is the probability of H1 and H2, because H is logically equivalent with the conjunction of H1 and H2. And the probability of a conjunction of H1 and H2 is just the probability of H2 times the probability of H1 given that H2 is true. And so if the probability that H1 is true, given that H2 is true, is much lower than 1, well then it's going to have to follow that the probability of H itself is much lower than 1. If that didn't make much sense, that's okay. I already explained this informally. Now, the fourth problem worth taking seriously for limited God hypotheses is what I call the evidential dilemma. This dilemma for limited God hypotheses is basically the following. Either they aren't supported by most of the evidence for theism, in which case limited God hypotheses are going to be too evidentially unsupported to be a plausible fallback option for the omnitheist, and so serious arguments against omnitheism are ipso facto arguments that lend significant support to global atheism, since the alternative theistic views take up a super tiny portion of the probability space allocated to theism, in which case serious arguments against omnitheism are also then arguments for global atheism and against generic theism, or limited God hypotheses succumb to most of the arguments against omnitheism, like suffering and hiddenness and religious confusion, etc. In which case, again, serious arguments against omnitheism are ipso facto arguments for global atheism and against generic theism, since they count against any version of theism. So, either way, serious arguments against omnitheism serve dually as serious arguments against generic theism and for global atheism. And since there are serious arguments against omnitheism, like the problem of evil, problem of divine hiddenness, etc., it follows that there are serious arguments for global atheism, in which case global atheism is itself worth taking seriously. So why do I think the original dilemma is true? Why, in other words, do I think that either limited God hypotheses aren't supported by most of the evidence for theism, or limited God hypotheses succumb to most of the arguments against omnitheism? Well, suppose limited God hypotheses are supported by most of the purported evidence for theism. Things like fine-tuning, moral knowledge, consciousness, psychophysical harmony, contingency, the universe's alleged beginning, religious experience, beauty, lawful regularity and order, etc. Then, I claim, limited God hypotheses succumb to most of the arguments against omnitheism. And that's because, very plausibly, the level of power, knowledge, and goodness required of God in order for these data to support limited God hypotheses is enough knowledge, power, and goodness to significantly reduce the amount, kinds, and intensity of evil in the world, to establish meaningful reciprocal relationships with every non-resistant finite person, to clarify the massive religious confusion which leads to interminable wars and strife and dehumanization, etc. And that, in short, is why I think this dilemma holds. I mean, think about what the limited God or gods need to be like for these bits of data to support limited God hypotheses. God needs to have literally created the entire universe. He needs to have control over the form of the laws of nature so as to ensure that the law structures allow for interesting, valuable phenomena to unfold. He needs to have control over the constants of the laws of nature so as to fine-tune them. He needs to have control over the initial conditions of the universe so as to fine-tune them. He needs to be able to guide evolution so that our basic moral beliefs and evaluative dispositions are largely truth-tracking, so as to ensure that we avoid all the other directions evolution could have taken under which we are irreparably in error about the moral domain. He needs to be able to control the psychophysical laws, so as to design them to be largely harmonious, and so as to ensure that conscious creatures even come about in the first place, as opposed to unconscious automata. If he's explaining contingency, he needs to be a necessary being capable of both creating and refraining from creating. He needs to be able to induce religious experiences in some manner, or else design the psychophysical laws in such a way that, under certain highly specified physical conditions, religious experiences occur, and so on. And it just strikes me as overwhelmingly plausible that if God can do all or most of that, well, then clearly God can also reduce suffering, establish the doxastic preconditions for a relationship with non-resistant persons, provide greater clarity about his existence and desires for humanity, make the universe less hostile, etc. For instance, if God literally created the universe and has control over both the form and content of its laws, as cosmological, nomological, and fine-tuning arguments require, then surely God could simply have made a law that when fawns start to burn in a forest fire, they're instantly and painlessly vaporized, or annihilated, or go unconscious. Or that, in physical conditions involving one human being starting to engage in non-consensual intercourse with another human being, the former human being is temporarily paralyzed, or temporarily loses consciousness, or etc. And ditto for divine hiddenness, religious confusion, and so on. If God has such control over the existence and content of laws, then it's extremely plausible that God could make it a law that anyone whose brain states indicate non-resistance to relationship with God has a super strong intuition or sense or inclination to believe that God exists, akin to our intuition or sense or inclination to believe that 1 + 1 = 2. So it seems incredibly plausible that if limited God hypotheses are to enjoy the support from these popular arguments for theism, then they'll also thereby succumb to most of the prominent arguments against omnitheism. Likewise, it just seems kinda silly to me to suggest that God can control the course of evolutionary history to the point of being able to guide it towards creatures having systematically truth-tracking moral faculties, yet he somehow can't guide evolution in such a way that creatures are one and all herbivores, or one and all photosynthesizers, or one and all chemosynthesizers, or just in the direction of maybe not hundreds of millions of years of animals ripping each other to shreds. It's like, oh yeah, I can guide evolution in such a way as to make very sophisticated creatures with largely truth-tracking moral faculties, but oh man, those photosynthesis, photosynthesis is very difficult, it's just too hard for me. Once again then, we see that if limited God hypotheses are to accrue the evidential support that theism allegedly gets from moral knowledge, limited God hypotheses ipso facto face problems of evil in full force. And I could continue on and on throughout these various arguments for theism and how they open limited God hypotheses up to standard arguments against omnitheism. For instance, if a limited God can control the character of psychophysical laws, then a limited God faces very serious challenges from the problem of evil, challenges I briefly detail in my response to Trent Horn on the problem of evil. I'm going to play 2 clips from that video.
So how should we answer this argument from gratuitous evil? Well, we could deny premise 1, just as we did for the general argument from evil. And some theistic philosophers like Peter Van Inwagen have done this. Van Inwagen says there will always be some evils that don't serve a greater good or purpose because that's the price of having an ecosystem that follows natural laws instead of a world where God manages every single thing and natural laws don't function.
So there are a number of problems with this. First, that's just clearly false, at least by my lights. I have 2 subpoints to justify why I think that's clearly false. First, in principle, God could alter these psychophysical laws which connect up animals' conscious states with their physical states. Psychophysical laws, by the way, are just descriptions of which conscious states are associated with which physical states. The idea here is that God could easily alter these laws so that, say, when animals are in the process of dying, for example, when they're starving to death, or being ripped apart by a predator, or being burned to death, when animals are in these sorts of physical states, the mental states mapped onto those physical states are not ones of horrific suffering, but are instead blissful mental states, or perhaps no mental states at all, kind of like anesthesia. God could then ensure that the only suffering that animals experience actually serves proportionate goods in the lives of those animals, such as helping the animals avoid damaging stimuli and eventually, say, reproduce. My overarching point in bringing up these alterations in psychophysical laws is that it's simply false that gratuitous evils are the price of having an ecosystem that follows natural laws, right? I just described a lawful ecosystem that God could, in principle, have actualized, and yet it doesn't contain gratuitous evil. It also doesn't involve God micromanaging every single thing in a lawless way. Also, notice that altering the psychophysical laws in this sort of way doesn't seem to result in the loss of any goods comparable to the newly achieved good of having prevented billions of instances of horrific animal suffering for trillions of animals throughout evolutionary history. The reason is that God is only here altering the psychophysical laws, not the physical laws or the physical states of reality. So, from a third-person perspective, the world would be identical to the actual world. The only changes would be in which conscious states of animals are associated with which of their physical states. All the same goods produced later in evolutionary history would obtain, such as the existence of humans, the existence of biodiversity, and so on. So it doesn't seem like any goods comparable to the prevention of the aforementioned instances of animal suffering would be lost if God were to alter the psychophysical laws in the manner described.
When it comes to the suffering of non-human animals, I'd bring up the thought experiment I posed to Alex O'Connor in our debate on God on Pints of Aquinas. Imagine humans left the Earth to colonize another planet. Should they instantly vaporize the Earth with an antimatter device to end the suffering of the non-human animals they leave behind? If people say, no, you should let the animals continue to exist in spite of their suffering, there's nothing wrong with that, then there's nothing wrong with God creating a world even though animals will suffer.
But that just clearly doesn't follow. Unlike God, we're situated within a pre-given context, with pre-given physical and psychophysical laws over which we have no control, and with pre-given creatures over whose constitution and characteristics we have no control. So when we make that sort of decision, we have to assess the relevant values involved, holding fixed that pre-given context. But that's completely different to the situation that God finds himself in. God is the very maker of that context to begin with. He isn't working within the constraints of pre-given physical and psychophysical laws, and nor is he working with pre-given creatures over whose constitution and characteristics he lacks control. No, he's the very author of those laws and creatures to begin with. Given this, he definitely could have avoided lots of evil while still preserving the goods of biological diversity, virtue, lawful order and regularity, complexity, diversity, beauty, and so on. God need only have created photosynthesizing creatures instead of ones that have to rip each other to shreds and parasitize one another to sustain themselves. He need only have slightly altered the psychophysical laws to prevent massive amounts of utterly atrocious evils while still retaining the same causal functional profile associated with those mental states, and hence still securing any goods causally downstream of those mental states, and so on down the list. This alone makes a reasonably compelling case in my mind for gratuitous evil. And it shows a hugely relevant dissimilarity between Trent's thought experiment on the one hand and the position that God is actually in on the other. I've also already responded to this point of Trent's in my response to his opening statement with Alex there, but I'm too lazy to fetch my response. I made an analogy with a chess game. We have to abide by the pre-given rules of chess, but God, as the very author of the game, could change those rules. So there's a relevant dissimilarity between us and God that doesn't allow us to infer that God would be permitted in creating our world, merely from the fact that we are permitted not to push the button destroying Earth. We and God are relevantly differently situated, which affects the range of moral reasons bearing on our respective choices. In one case, the choice is to preserve something given a pre-given context, and in another case, God's case, the choice is to create that context out of whole cloth with complete control over its character. And also, if Trent is allowed to appeal to this sort of thought experiment, so too can I appeal to the following thought experiment. I have a button, I have a dream, I have a button that will only alter the psychophysical laws about which mental states are paired with which physical states of animals when those animals are in the process of starving or being burned alive or being ripped to shreds by predators. This button, if pushed, will swap the conscious states of sheer agony with conscious states of bliss, or perhaps conscious states similar to an anesthetic. Will you push that button? I say, obviously. It would seem monstrous not to do so. And we can also further stipulate, if we like, that these psychophysical laws are only in effect prior to the existence of humans. So in that way, we don't affect the moral reasons that we have for preventing animal suffering. We can include that if we want. So again, it would seem monstrous not to push that button. And just as Trent draws a conclusion about God from his button-pushing case, so too can we now indict God for his failure to push this proverbial button. Or take this other case. I have a button that can rewrite evolutionary history. In short, it will still result in all the same humans, and you and every other human will live exactly the life that you actually lead, but pre-human evolutionary history will be rewritten to be populated expressly by photosynthesizing and chemosynthesizing animals. Their skin can just absorb photons and make energy that way instead of having to, tear each other apart. Thus, if you press the button, we not only remove vast amounts of horrific suffering, but we also preserve the goods of a vast diversity of organisms and animals, a lawful environment, the eventual development of humans and their virtues and their free will, the grandeur of the universe, and so on down the list. The question is, do you press that button? I submit to you that the answer is obvious. Of course you do. Incidentally, it's also worth noting that the evidential dilemma is an especially serious problem for Goff. For Goff thinks God literally has the ability to vaporize Jesus' body and supernaturally induce among the apostles religious experiences as of a risen Christ. And yet, we're to believe that God also can't vaporize a fawn's burned and maimed body, starving for days on the charred forest floor. As one of my colleagues here at Princeton suggested, maybe fawns just have too much fur for God. We're to believe that God can transform our bodies, secure an afterlife for us, and save us, as Goff's Christianity seems to require, yet can't save the burned and starving fawn, or the rape victim, or the drowning child, or the Jew gasping for air in the Zyklon-filled chamber at Auschwitz. Such a view about God's abilities, that God can do the former of these, but literally can't do the latter, is just overwhelmingly implausible to me. The broader point here is that Goff's view is especially prone to arguments from evil, given the wide-ranging abilities that Goff ascribes to God. Here's the overarching takeaway. If limited God hypotheses are to be supported by the main and arguably most promising ways of supporting theism, then they have to afford God so much power, knowledge, and goodness that the hypotheses will also then succumb to the main arguments against omnitheism. And hence, limited God hypotheses face a dilemma. They must either give up most of the arguments for theism, or else they too are threatened by most of the primary arguments against omnitheism. Or to put things slightly differently, the more you tailor your hypothesis so that it avoids the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, religious confusion, etc., the less available your hypothesis is for confirmation from standard theistic arguments. And as explained earlier, this will mean that arguments against omnitheism serve dually as arguments against theism simpliciter, and since the former are worth taking seriously, the latter are too. In which case, global atheism is also worth taking seriously. As a final note, under this fourth problem for limited God hypotheses, this evidential dilemma also helps us see that things aren't smooth sailing for the limited God hypotheses, even if we can somehow offer some principled, independently motivated, non-arbitrary, non-ad hoc limitation or restriction on God. Without sustained reflection and detailed investigation into these more principled limited God hypotheses, it's not at all clear that any of them will match the confirmatory predictions of theism while simultaneously avoiding disconfirmatory predictions regarding evil, hiddenness, religious confusion, etc., while also not being susceptible to other independent arguments. And in fact, the evidential dilemma strongly suggests that none of them will successfully toe this line. To my knowledge, we don't yet really even have such worked out, independently motivated, principled, and non-arbitrary models of limited gods. And so it's at best premature to say global atheism is not worth taking seriously because of the presence of limited God hypotheses to which one might retreat. A fifth problem worth taking seriously for limited God hypotheses, or maybe more accurately, a problem for ones which limit God's power but not his goodness, is that they arguably straightforwardly succumb to certain deontological versions of the problem of evil. Instead of explaining this myself, I'll play a clip from John Buck on Emerson Green's channel, and you'll get a taste of how deontological versions of the problem of evil can still get up and running against such hypotheses. As do, by the way, certain common sense problems of evil, which just take the world or certain aspects of the world to just be intuitively too bad for a good God to permissibly create. These arguments, I think, are worth taking seriously, and they're certainly taken seriously in the literature. Anyway, let me play the clip.
Additionally, supposing that God intentionally created our world, I would expect that if God were all good, he'd not create a world that could allow for evils to remain undefeated, as that would violate some deontological principles that God is committed to, given his perfect nature. Now, since Alex is a consequentialist, I don't think this objection will be very persuasive to him, but at least for me, who has deontological sympathies, I would find it quite hard to praise a God that would allow 100 million people to experience horrendous evils that go undefeated, just so that 100 billion could experience the glories of heaven.
And then a sixth and final problem worth taking seriously that faces limited God hypotheses, or at least the ones that are meant to be able to both secure the main and most powerful pieces of evidence for theism while avoiding the main and most powerful pieces of evidence against omnitheism, is that they tend to just seem objectionably ad hoc, in the sense that they seem specifically designed to accommodate precisely the data we observe. To accomplish this, such hypotheses seem to just fine-tune God's desires and his power so that he wants and has the ability to produce precisely the valuable things that we observe, but is simply unable to prevent, or isn't good or knowledgeable enough to prevent, precisely the disvaluable things we observe. Needless to say, ad hoc hypotheses like this tend to be poor hypotheses, since while they tend to predict the data exceptionally well, they do so at the cost of correspondingly lowering the prior or intrinsic probability of the hypotheses. It's essentially the problem of likelihood ratio rigging that I covered in my Bayes theorem video here on the screen. This problem won't afflict every limited God hypothesis on offer, but it's a very serious concern for the ones which try to inherit theism's confirmatory predictions while avoiding its disconfirmatory ones. And those, of course, are the only limited God hypotheses we should be focusing on here, since those are really the only live fallback options for the omnitheist. A closely related problem for such limited God hypotheses concerns falsifiability. If they really can predict or accommodate evil, hiddenness, religious confusion, hostility to the universe, etc., while also predicting the various great features of the universe like consciousness, fine-tuning, lawful regularity, beauty, psychophysical harmony, moral knowledge, etc., what can't they predict or accommodate? I mean, it might sound like it's a good thing that little, if anything, would disconfirm your hypothesis, but it's actually disastrous news, since given Bayes' theorem, if little, if anything, would disconfirm your hypothesis, then little, if anything, would confirm your hypothesis as well, and you end up collapsing the ability of your theory to be strongly supported by any evidence. This too is explained mathematically in my Bayes theorem video in the section on falsifiability, but I'll let you watch that in your spare time. And of course, it's worth noting here that atheists can always likewise modify their atheistic hypotheses in light of disconfirming evidence, similar to how Cameron suggests modifying his omnitheistic hypothesis to a limited God hypothesis to accommodate recalcitrant data. Anyway, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself because a similar point will come up again in my fourth main response to Cameron's video at the end of this video, and I'm going to go into much more depth then. So, in summary, this is my second main response to Cameron's video. Limited God views face serious problems. And so rejection of them, in addition to the unlimited God of omnitheism, should be taken seriously, in which case atheism should be taken seriously. My third main response to Cameron's case is that atheistic arguments like the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, etc., can considerably decrease generic theism's probability, even well below 50% in principle, and this isn't changed by the fact that some versions of theism predict the data just as well as atheism, or the most likely variants of atheism. If that's so, then the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, and many other of the standard arguments for local atheism with respect to an unlimited God can thereby also be arguments for global atheism, or at least arguments that significantly raise the probability of global atheism, which I take to be clearly within the class of arguments for global atheism. To explain how this is the case, though, we need a quick lesson in Bayesian reasoning. So let me just start out by saying that I found this resource, like the other day, on Bayes bar diagrams by Skillful Reasoning, an introduction to formal logic and other tools for careful thought. Looks like a really interesting website, so check it out. Like, apparently, maybe it's like a book in progress. I think it looks like a book in progress. But a lot of this stuff, it's like basically all online. I mean, not about this book and those things, but it's like propositional logic, basic concepts, definitions, 4 kinds of definitions, lots of stuff that I cover in, for instance, my Doing Philosophy playlist. But like first goes through propositional logic, then modal logic, then predicate logic, then non-deductive inferences, confirmation theory. So this is where we get into like a primer on probability, Bayesian confirmation theory, etc., evidence and rationality, and all this sort of stuff. Looks super duper interesting. So I can't believe I just came across this. So major shout out to Joshua Hershey. I don't even know who this is. And it says it's a new work in progress. And it doesn't even give us any information about who Joshua Hershey is. Maybe I'd have to look it up. But anyway, really interesting stuff. But let's get back to where I was on Bayesian bar diagrams. Oh, by the way, I went through these in detail and gave lots of examples in my Bayes theorem video. Check out that video if you want more. This is just a very brief crash course on what Bayesian bar diagrams are, and I'm going to be using them to bolster my third main response to Cameron's case. So Bayesian confirmation theory says you should update your beliefs by conditionalizing on any new evidence you acquire. Conditionalization can be described mathematically, but we can also think about it in a more intuitive visual way. To visualize the process of conditionalization, we can use segmented bar diagrams that we can call Bayes bars. A Bayes bar depicts your credences, or your levels of confidence, or your degrees of belief, in a set of propositions at a particular time, with the length of each segment representing your degree of belief, or your credence, or your level of confidence in a specific proposition. If the propositions are mutually exclusive and exhaustive, then the total length of the Bayes bar is 1, or 100% of the probability space. For propositions to be mutually exclusive is for each of them to be incompatible with the rest, right? So the truth of any one of them precludes the truth of the rest of them. And for propositions to be exhaustive means that they basically just exhaust the entire possibility space. So they collectively cover all the possibilities. So we'll begin with a Bayes bar representing your prior credences in a hypothesis H and its negation. These are your credences in the relevant hypotheses prior to taking into account the relevant bit of evidence that you're going to kind of update on, that you're going to then take into account and change your credences accordingly based on how well the relevant hypotheses predict the relevant data. So yeah, we begin with a Bayes bar representing your prior credences in a hypothesis H and its negation, not H. Since H and not H are mutually exclusive and exhaustive, their probabilities must sum to 1, or 100%. Let's suppose your credences are 0.4 and 0.6 respectively. Here is a Bayes bar representing those prior credences, so 40% of the bar goes to H, and 60% of the bar goes to not H. Next, we subdivide each segment of the bar into smaller segments, representing your conditional credences about evidence E, given each of those two hypotheses. Right, so let's suppose your conditional credence in E, given H, is 3/4. So that's just to say that, like, hey, given that H is true, how likely is it that E would be true? And in this case, we're supposing that, hey, it's about 3/4 likely, given H, that E would be true. So yeah, in other words, you think E is 3 times more likely than not E, given the assumption that H is true. To represent this, we apportion 3/4 of the blue region, right? That's the region that we're allocating to H. We apportion 3/4 of the blue region to E and 1/4 to not E. And these fractions of the blue region make up 30% of the whole bar and 10% of the whole bar, respectively, right? Because the blue region here is 40% of the whole bar, and 3/4 of that is going to be 30% that's allocated to E, and 1/4 of that 40% is 10% of the whole bar, which is how much of the total bar is allocated to H and not E being true. Suppose you also think that E is half as likely as not E on the assumption that H is false. So then we divide the yellow segment of the bar, giving 20% to E and 40% to not E, right? Because we have 60% of the bar allocated to not H. And so if we think that not E is twice as likely than E, given not H, well then among this 60% of the bar, 2/3 of it is going to have to be allocated to not E, and only 1/3 of it is going to have to be allocated to E. And of course, 1/3 of that whole 60% is going to be 20%, and 2/3 of that whole 60% is going to be 40%. So 40% of the whole bar is then allocated to not H and not E being true, and then 20% of the bar is allocated to not H and E being true. Using diagonal shading for the segments where E is false, the subdivided bar looks like this. So here we have diagonal shading of the segments of the whole bar in which E is false. This prior Bayes bar, as we can call it, represents your credences prior to learning E. How should your beliefs change if you discover that E is true? Well, when you learn that E is true, this new evidence eliminates the shaded segments of the bar, since E is false in those segments, and yet you learned that E is true, right? And so you eliminate those, and then only 2 unshaded segments remain. The 30% under which H and E is true, and the 20% under which not H and E is true. Because you learned that E is true, you now regard H and E and not H and E as the only possibilities. And so your credences in those propositions should add up to 100%. And so then we must do what probability folk call renormalization. We have to renormalize these probabilities. We basically just have to increase them so that they sum to 1, while keeping the same proportions between them. In other words, we have to stretch the bar back to its full length, keeping the same ratio between the blue and yellow segments. In this example, the truncated bar is half as long as the original, and so we need to double its length. Imagine basically stretching the bar like a rubber band so that the segments maintain their relative proportions. That's what the process of conditionalization looks like. Some segments of the prior Bayes bar are eliminated by new evidence, and the remaining segments expand. And then here's the final result, which we call the posterior Bayes bar. This is a result of basically renormalizing this, basically doubling it so that it takes up 100% of the probability space, while keeping the proportion between the blue bar here and the yellow bar here the same. And that results in 60% of the posterior Bayes bar being allocated to H and E, and 40% being allocated to not H and E. The posterior bar represents your posterior credences after conditionalizing on evidence E. Your posterior credence in hypothesis H is 60%, right? Because 60% of your probability space is afforded to H. Whereas if you recall, your prior credence in H had only been 40%, right? Remember your prior Bayes bar. H only occupied 40% of the probability space there. So then notice that your credence in H has increased, right? It went from 40% to 60%. And so E confirms H. In other words, E is evidence for H. And at the same time, your credence in not H decreased. And so E disconfirms not H. In other words, E is evidence against not H. It lowers its probability. Bayes bars make the process of conditionalization intuitive, and they also offer another important advantage as well. Namely, we can use them to estimate how we should update our beliefs, even without assigning precise prior probabilities. And Joshua Hershey gives an example of how to do that on here. So with that little lesson in Bayesian reasoning, we now turn to our arts and crafts segment. Hello, my friends, and welcome back. I'm so glad you're here with us today. We're going to do something a little special today. That's right, we're going to create some Bayes bar diagrams. Now, don't you worry if that sounds fancy or new. We're going to take it one little happy Bayes bar at a time. To get started, we need to lay down our foundation. Think of this as like the base of our beautiful intellectual painting. So first, you're going to take an 8.5 by 11 inch paper, and you're going to fold it in thirds. Like so. We're also going to need some special utensils today. We've got phthalo blue and phthalo black. First, you're going to take some of that blue and just draw a line right along that crease. All right? Doesn't matter if it's not perfect. Nothing is perfect in God's creation. This is the beginnings of our Bayes bar, which is simple yet so full of potential at this stage. And just for ease of exposition, let's draw a line right down the middle, representing 50% of this space allotted to theism, and 50% of this space allotted to atheism. The fact that this line is drawn in the middle here is ultimately inessential to the point that I'm going to make. This is just a little toy Bayesian mathematical model, and it's just meant to illustrate a broader point. That point can be illustrated by moving this line along this bar in various ways to suit your fancy. We can divide the theistic bar into theistic hypotheses which posit an unlimited God and ones which posit limited gods. I'm going to make the limited God hypothesis kind of small, but remember, a Bayes bar is a Bayes bar no matter how small. We're going to let that be L for limited. And we're going to say that takes up 5% of the 50% allotted to theism. And by contrast, not L takes up 95% of 50%. Over here on the global atheism side, we can divide up global atheism into directed atheistic hypotheses, where the atheistic foundation is directed towards producing things of value, and non-directed atheistic hypotheses, which are probably going to be dominated by suitably fleshed out naturalistic views. Let's just say the directed atheistic views take up 20% of the 50% allotted to atheism, and then, correspondingly, non-directed views will take up 80% of the 50% allotted to atheism. We also want to represent the extent to which each of these more specific hypotheses predict the data. And the data in question we're going to call E, standing for facts about evil. So let's say conditional on a limited God hypothesis, it's about 1/10 likely that we'd see evil, and about 9/10 likely that we wouldn't. By contrast, if an unlimited God hypothesis is true, it's pretty dang surprising that we'd see the facts about evil we observe. So let's make that a very tiny bar at the very bottom of the unlimited God portion. And we're going to say these facts about evil occur in about 1 in 10,000 of the possibilities under which an unlimited God exists. So here it's about 1,000 times more surprising that we see the facts about evil under the unlimited God hypothesis as it is that we see the facts about evil under the limited God hypothesis. So this here is going to be 1 out of 10,000. And for not E, we've got 9,999 out of 10,000. Hypotheses on which the atheistic foundation is directed towards value are also going to make evil very surprising. So let's just say that's also 1 in 10,000 chance, conditional on D, that we'd see E. And then finally, like the limited God hypotheses, the undirected atheistic hypotheses are not going to make it as surprising as it is on directed atheistic hypotheses and unlimited God hypotheses that there's all the evil that we observe. So let's just give that a toy number of 1/10 probability. This 9/10 is obviously not 9/10 of the entire Bayes bar. That would be silly. It's just 9/10 of the proportion allocated to not D. In other words, this is really just the probability of not E given not D. This is the probability of E given not D, and so on for the rest of these. And now here comes the fun part. Suppose we look around and we see some pretty nasty things going on. horrific, seemingly pointless suffering. That's evidence, my friends, evidence. In other words, we learned that E is true, and so we want to cross off all the portions of the probability space on which E is false. So you can just draw your lines like so. So now we just got the remaining portions of the bar in which E is true. And now we need to renormalize. So take out your fallow black and use that for the math. You know, some folks don't like math, but those folks just haven't seen its beauty yet. So for the renormalization, I'm not as interested in breaking this up into L, not L, D, and not D. I'm really just interested in T and not T, theism and atheism, to make a point. So starting with the bottom left, we've got 5%, so 1 out of 20, times 1/2, because this is 5% of the 50%, and then times 1/10, because this is 1/10 of this bar. And then we add that to 95%, so 19/20ths times 1/2, because that's 95% of 50%, times 1 in 10,000. Turn out to this side, we have 20%, so 1/5 of half the bar, times the 1 out of 10,000. And then we add that to 80%, so 4/5 times 1/2, times 1/10. And there, when you put things into a common denominator, the same common denominator as over on the left, you get 16,004. To renormalize and determine the probability of not T, we just take the numerator over here, 16,004, and divide it by the numerator over here plus the numerator over here. So that's 17,023. That is the probability of not T given E. That ends up being a whopping 94%. Notice here that limited God versions of theism predict the data just as well as the most predictively successful version of atheism. And in fact, if you calculate the probability of E given not T, it turns out to be less than 1/10. So actually, limited God hypotheses here predict the data of evil better than atheism does. And yet notice that once we updated on the data of evil, the probability of atheism went up to 94%, whereas prior it was 50%, it now went up to 94%. So remember, in Bayesian reasoning, as in everyday life, every new piece of evidence is an opportunity to grow. And this again is just an informal toy Bayesian model about how some piece of evidence can actually favor the limited God hypothesis. It could be evidence for the limited God hypothesis, even if it's pretty strong evidence against theism more generally. And that concludes today's arts and crafts lesson. Remember that everyone can be a Bayesian. You just have to believe, or at least have credence. The broader point here is that arguments like the problem of evil can still significantly lower generic theism's probability. And this isn't changed by the fact that some versions of theism predict the data just as well, in fact better than, atheism. So we can't reason in the way Cameron appears to be reasoning, namely that since evil isn't evidence against certain specific versions of theism, it thereby won't be evidence, or at least won't be significant evidence against theism's simpliciter. I mean, again, return to Cameron's video, he said the problem of evil doesn't even support atheism. But that's just a bad inference, as our toy Bayesian model illustrates. There are lots of cases in which a piece of data disconfirms a general hypothesis, even while it confirms a more specific variant of that very hypothesis. It's similar to the following example. Suppose we have a crime scene, and there are two classes of equally good candidate criminals for the crime that we know only one person committed: 4 blonde suspects and 4 brunette suspects. Suppose we look at footage of the crime scene, and forensic experts determine that the body shape of the criminal rules out 3 of the 4 blonde suspects, but only 1 of the 4 brunette suspects. Notice that this piece of data is actually evidence that the remaining blonde suspect committed the crime. The odds that he, the remaining blonde suspect, is the criminal, after updating on this newfound evidence, have gone from 1 in 8 to 1 in 4. So the piece of data in question is evidence for a specific version of the generic blonde criminal hypothesis, which is just the hypothesis that a blonde person committed the crime. But even still, this piece of data is also clearly evidence against the generic blonde criminal hypothesis, which again states that a blonde person committed the crime. Whereas before learning about the evidence, the generic blonde criminal hypothesis had a probability of 1/2. After learning about the evidence, its probability is only 1/4. So again, a piece of data can be good evidence against a generic hypothesis, even while it is evidence for a specific variant of that generic hypothesis. And it's ultimately the same thing that's going on with standard arguments against omnitheism. Even if evil is evidence for specific versions of theism, like limited God hypotheses, it's still evidence against generic theism and for global atheism. And that's because omnitheism takes up a pretty big chunk of the generic theism probability space, and conditional unsuitable background predicts the data much worse than suitably specified versions of naturalism, which take up a pretty big chunk of global atheism's probability space. Incidentally, I brought this problem up to Cameron on Twitter, or X, or Shitter. Dr. Randall Rouser, or the tentative apologist, made a YouTube response video to Cameron's video. Then he tweeted about it. Then Cameron said, Mr. Tentative, actually it's Dr. Tentative. Mr. Tentative can't deny the obvious point that the main arguments for atheism aren't arguments for atheism. They can just as well be used by non-traditional theists to justify their brand of theism. To which I said in reply, listen, E, like facts about suffering or evil, can be evidence against T, or theism, generic theism, even if E is evidence for specific versions of theism, like the non-traditional ones that Cameron is mentioning. And I said more on this in my response video soon to come. Now, I think it's pretty clear here that Cameron is briefly laying out his main point from his video, right? We watched his video, we know what he's trying to say, and here he's replying to a reply to his video. So I think it's pretty clear that Cameron is here, like, very briefly laying out at least one of his main points from his video. But after going back and forth a bit, Cameron eventually responded to me as follows. What I have in mind relative to my video is that S, in this case the data of suffering, does not provide P-inductive evidence for not T, or global atheism, the negation of generic theism. In other words, it does not follow that if there is a C-inductive argument, then I should take atheism seriously. C-inductive arguments are cheap, after all. By the way, P-inductive evidence for a hypothesis is just evidence that makes a hypothesis more probable than not, so it boosts the probability of a hypothesis above 50%. P-inductive evidence is contrasted with C-inductive evidence, or C-inductive arguments, which simply raise the probability of a hypothesis, not necessarily raising it above 50%. So Cameron is here tweeting that what he has in mind relative to his video is that the facts about suffering don't provide the kind of evidence for global atheism that makes it more probable than not. And then he says, in other words, it doesn't follow that if there are arguments from suffering that raise the probability of atheism, then he should take atheism seriously. Now, I think there are several issues with Cameron's response here. First, in Cameron's original tweet, seemingly restating one of his allegedly obvious main contentions of his video, he says the main arguments for atheism, like the problem of evil, aren't even arguments for atheism. But that's simply mistaken. Such arguments at least raise the probability of atheism by providing C-inductive evidence for atheism. And so, such arguments provide support for atheism, and hence count as arguments for atheism. I mean, Cameron even said in his video that they don't even support atheism. And in my view, that's just clearly mistaken. So what Cameron claims is quote-unquote obvious is, in my view, actually obviously false. Second, my point isn't that because there are serious C-inductive arguments for atheism that raise its probability, Cameron should thereby take atheism seriously. Instead, I'm challenging Cameron's argument for the conclusion that he shouldn't take atheism seriously, pointing out that his argument is flawed. It rests on a poor inference. Right, remember, Cameron was the one inferring that he shouldn't take atheism seriously from the fact that the main and most powerful pieces of purported evidence for atheism, like evil, don't actually disfavor certain specific versions of theism. But that doesn't follow. It's not a good inference, because a collection of data, D1 through Dn, such as various facts about evil, hiddenness, religious confusion, etc., can easily render a general hypothesis like theism improbable, or can at least render global atheism sufficiently probable to be worth taking seriously, even if D1 through Dn favors or confirms specific variants of generic theism. So I'm simply pointing out that Cameron's case has, in my view, a fatal flaw, because it rests on a mistaken inference. I can't see how anyone can walk away from Cameron's video and not think that he was trying to infer from the fact that data like evil, etc., that don't disfavor and in fact may very well favor certain versions of theism, that therefore they don't even support atheism. And that's just straightforwardly and demonstrably mistaken. Of course, Cameron could still say that he doesn't and shouldn't take atheism seriously because the C-inductive arguments from D1 through Dn don't raise atheism's probability enough to make it even a live option. Like, it's still extremely improbable, according to Cameron. But of course, that's a very contentious first-order judgment about the strength of the evidence for and against theism. And I think divergent judgments here should clearly be taken seriously. Of course, maybe Cameron doesn't even take seriously both the atheist and theist criticisms of the fine-tuning argument, moral knowledge argument, psychophysical harmony argument, etc. But in my view, one, that's a silly position. 2, this hypothetical response just isn't the line of reasoning that Cameron was forwarding in his video. Instead, it would clearly represent a dialectical retreat upon noticing the above-mentioned flaw in his video's reasoning. 3, it's a much more radical view about what should be taken seriously, one which wasn't justified in the video, or in my view, anywhere else in Cameron's work. And 4, this hypothetical response amounts to saying that while there are arguments that may considerably increase global atheism's probability, they don't overcome the significant probabilistic impact that the theistic evidence has, such that theism is still overall far more probable than atheism. But then all this stuff about a limited God not being touched by the problem of evil, etc., isn't really doing much work here. Instead, this hypothetical response just notes one's first-order judgment about the strength of the evidence of things like fine-tuning, psychophysical harmony, etc., and how this evidence ultimately dominates the evidence for global atheism. But views that disagree with this first-order judgment here are definitely worth taking seriously. There are serious criticisms of these theistic arguments. Whether or not those criticisms ultimately work, I think they should be taken seriously. So in the end, I think this third response is a very serious problem for Cameron's video. Alright, my fourth and final response to Cameron's video is that the same quote-unquote problem that Cameron identifies afflicts many, if not most, of the arguments for theism, and certainly most of the Bayesian arguments for theism, which tend to be among the better ones, and almost all cosmological arguments given the gap problem. Consider that global atheism, like generic theism, is just a general class of hypotheses, each of which says or implies that no God exists. There are lots of hypotheses like this, and lots of them differ in their predictions about what the world would be like. Apologists and theistic philosophers of religion typically only focus on naturalism specifically, where naturalism is understood as involving, among other things, no fundamental directedness or orientation towards producing things of value. But there are lots of atheistic hypotheses which maintain that fundamental reality is directed towards producing things of value in much the way that the omni-God is, and these, or many of these versions of atheism, are left untouched by most, if not all, of the arguments for theism that have considerable weight. Let's first tour through a small fraction of these atheistic value selection hypotheses, bearing in mind that there may of course be some overlap between some of them. Atheistic axiarchism says that no God exists, but it's a fundamental principle that things exist and happen because they're good. See, for instance, philosopher Eric Steinhardt's article, 6 Axiarchic Arguments for Characterization of Axiarchism, references involving it, and a discussion of various arguments for axiarchism. There are also collections of hypotheses which we might call atheistic value-directed fundamental reality hypotheses. One such atheistic value-directed fundamental reality hypothesis posits teleological laws, affirming that one or more fundamental laws guide reality towards realizing states of value. See Thomas Nagel's Mind and Cosmos for a development and defense of a view of this sort. Another view like this says that a foundational quantum field is disposed to produce valuable states. Another says that a foundational universal wave function is disposed to realize valuable states. Another says that the cosmos itself is a foundational reality disposed to evolve into valuable states, and which as a whole synchronically grounds valuable constituents. Another hypothesis here is what we could call an impersonally construed Brahman hypothesis, where the hypothesis posits that the foundation of reality is a pervasive, infinite, unchanging, eternal, concrete reality of pure, impersonal, or aperspectival consciousness, and which is directed towards or disposed towards value. A similar hypothesis is an impersonally construed Neoplatonic one, which is an absolutely simple, partless, foundational, transcendent, impersonal, concrete reality disposed to produce valuable results. This is actually somewhat similar to a view that Eric Steinhardt defends in his books Believing in Dawkins and Atheistic Platonism, a Manifesto. Likewise, there is an impersonally construed Thomistic being itself hypothesis, which posits that the foundation of reality is an absolutely simple, purely actual, impersonal being itself, which is also directed towards producing things of value. Oh, and by the way, the arguments for why, like, a purely actual being itself must have an intellect or be personal tend to be incredibly poor. See, for example, the chapter in my book, Existential Inertia and Classical Theistic Proofs on the gap problem. And then another hypothesis here, it's not really an atheistic value-directed fundamental reality hypothesis, because it doesn't necessarily specify that the fundamental atheistic reality is sort of directed towards producing things of value under that description. Instead, we just specify the various pieces of data that theists like to pinpoint, and then we just say, hey, the atheistic foundational reality is directed towards producing those, which is why I call it ad hoc atheism. It says that there's one fundamental non-divine being disposed to produce fine-tuning, consciousness, moral knowledge, beauty, lawful regularity, psychophysical harmony, contingency, etc. Provided we finesse the details in the right way, these hypotheses predict most, if not all, of the pieces of data that allegedly considerably favor theism. Just as theism, or more accurately, omnitheism, allegedly predicts things like fine-tuning, moral knowledge, consciousness, psychophysical harmony, lawful regularity, beauty, the intelligibility and mathematical describability of the universe, etc., by virtue of the fact that these are really valuable things, and a perfect being would thereby have reason to produce them, so too these various atheistic hypotheses predict these data by virtue of the fact that these are really valuable things, and the foundational atheistic reality is, like God, disposed to produce valuable things. In fact, since many of these atheistic hypotheses even posit realities transcending the universe that could easily be accorded the status of necessarily existent realities endowed with indeterministic causal powers, many of these atheistic hypotheses are also entirely compatible with the whole gambit of cosmological arguments from the alleged beginning of the universe, from contingency, from change, from composition, and so on, at least provided that the stage 2 inferences to attributes that could in principle only be had by a god fail, which is certainly a position worth taking seriously. In fact, stage 2 inferences here are typically very poor, and the ones that aren't poor are ones that would equally rule out limited God hypotheses, and so would be unavailable to the defender of Cameron's video, since then, arguments against omnitheism would ipso facto be arguments against generic theism. Of course, you might here try to point to some arguments that purport to uniquely favor theism, even over these atheistic value selection hypotheses, such as, reports of alleged miracles, or maybe religious experience, or things like that. But there are 3 problems with this response. First, rejecting these remaining arguments is at least worth taking seriously, which is the only bar that needs to be met for my purposes. Second, it's equally true, as I showed in my first response to Cam's video, that there are also arguments that purport to uniquely favor atheism, even over the limited God hypotheses. So again, this doesn't really break symmetry between my parody here of Cameron's reasoning and Cameron's original reasoning. And third and finally, it's not even clear that the full range of facts about religious experience, miracles, etc. favor theism over these atheistic value selection hypotheses. After all, under many of these atheistic value selection hypotheses, we have some reason to expect positively transformative miracles and religious experiences that cultivate moral improvement and a deeper appreciation for ultimate reality and for others, given that these are very valuable states of affairs. In fact, we might have here a better explanation than theistic explanations of the fact that many religious experiences are contradictory in content, even though they're positively transformative of the lives of those who experience them. And likewise of the fact that many purported miracles occur in a wide variety of contradictory traditions, but likewise lead to positive transformation or healing from illness, etc. So, stepping back, the broader problem for Cameron here is that the exact same alleged problem that afflicts atheistic arguments, namely that they fail to establish the falsity of various versions of theism, and in fact pinpoint evidence predicted by those versions of theism, likewise afflicts theistic arguments. They, too, fail to establish the falsity of various versions of atheism, and in fact pinpoint evidence predicted by those versions of atheism. If this should lead us to no longer take atheism seriously, then we should also no longer take theism seriously. And then agnostics will rule the world. In fact, at this juncture, allow me to just parody Cameron's video to bring out the force of this response.
Now, the best argument that atheists have, at least that I've found, is the problem of evil.
Now, the best argument that I've found is the fine-tuning argument, or psychophysical harmony, or consciousness, or contingency. Insert one of the more sophisticated and somewhat forceful arguments here. Let's just pick fine-tuning.
But you know what? I should probably pause the story really quickly and just explain what this argument is a little bit more in depth, because somewhat counterintuitively, it actually plays a central role in why I no longer take atheism seriously.
Somewhat counterintuitively, the fine-tuning argument plays a central role in why I no longer take theism seriously.
There's a really common way that it's expressed these days. Premise 1, if God exists, pointless suffering does not exist. Premise 2, pointless suffering exists. Therefore, 3, conclusion, God does not exist. Now, as you might expect, just like atheists have responses to the arguments for God's existence, Christians have responses to both premises and the argument from evil. Some Christians argue that God can allow pointless suffering. Others argue that while some suffering might seem pointless on the surface, it still nevertheless has a purpose.
Of course, non-theists have responses to the fine-tuning argument, from multiverse objections to the electrons in love objection to the divine psychology problem to questioning the data of fine-tuning itself, etc.
But that's not what I'm doing in this video. I wasn't convinced that atheism is silly because Christians have responses to these premises.
But I wasn't convinced theism is silly because atheists have responses to the fine-tuning argument.
The reason why I don't take atheism seriously any longer is because even if we accept the atheist's strongest argument, it still wouldn't prove atheism.
The reason why I don't take theism seriously any longer is because even if we accept the theist's strongest argument, it still wouldn't prove theism.
But so why doesn't the problem of evil establish atheism?
But so why doesn't the fine-tuning argument establish theism?
Well, simply because there are many other kinds of gods that it doesn't rule out.
Well, simply because there are many other versions of atheism that it doesn't rule out.
The British philosopher Philip Goff is a really good example of someone that adopts a sort of non-standard view of God.
So we're in a situation where the believers are tying themselves up in knots trying to explain suffering. The atheists are trying to tie themselves up in knots trying to explain fine-tuning. When in fact, there are middle ground options that can elegantly account for both of these data points. Consider, for example, the hypothesis of a God of limited power.
Consider, for example, the hypothesis that the foundation of reality is not divine, but is nevertheless oriented toward or directed toward producing things of value. I'm sorry, Philip. I'm not making fun of you. I love you, Philip, truly. Your work is stellar, and I love your books and your papers and whatnot. We're just having some fun here.
Maybe God simply can't create complex life in an instant. Maybe the only way God can create intelligent life is by creating a universe with the right physics that is eventually going to evolve intelligent life. And God's like, I'm sorry, I know it's going to be messy. This is all I can do. Is this or nothing? I think this hypothesis can account for both the fine-tuning in terms of God's purposes and the suffering in terms of God's limitations.
I think this hypothesis can account for both fine-tuning in terms of the disposition towards producing valuable creatures on the part of this foundational entity, and the suffering in terms of this entity's limitations.
So even though God is all good, perfectly benevolent on this view, given his limit in power, there's no way that he can stop all of the suffering in the world. What I want you to notice here, and this is really important, the problem of evil, which is, once again, one of the atheists' best arguments, doesn't touch this particular view of God that we just went over. It doesn't touch it at all.
What I want you to notice here, and this is really important, the fine-tuning argument, which is once again one of the theists' best arguments, doesn't touch this particular view of atheism. It doesn't touch it at all.
What I'm saying here is that the best case scenario for the atheist in this argument should really just lead us to revise our view of God. It shouldn't lead us to become atheists.
The best case scenario for the theist in this argument should really just lead us to revise our view of atheism. It shouldn't lead us to become theists.
Keep in mind, I'm not saying that the problem of evil is sound or persuasive. Personally, I think there are many good responses to the problem of evil, like the soul-building theodicy. I'm saying that even if we grant it, hypothetically, if we grant it, it doesn't come anywhere close to even establishing atheism. So
all I'm saying is that even if we grant the fine-tuning argument, hypothetically, it doesn't come anywhere close to even establishing theism. Now, Cameron does try to anticipate something like this objection in his video, so let's continue on.
something else important I want you to notice is that the same cannot be said of arguments for God's existence.
Yes, it clearly can. I just showed how it can. It can be said for almost every Bayesian or abductive argument for theism, and it can also be said for the best parts of the best deductive arguments for theism, namely stage 1 of cosmological arguments like the contingency argument, the Kalam, etc. And by the way, I only included the Kalam in that list because I think Cameron is at least sympathetic to it. And again, stage 2 inferences are generally quite poor, and the ones that aren't poor, like the argument from limits, are ones that would equally rule out limited God hypotheses, thus defeating Cameron's whole point, since then arguments against omnitheism would ipso facto be arguments against generic theism.
If we grant that the arguments go through for God's existence, then they would actually prove that at least one God is real.
No, they wouldn't, though. The best arguments for theism don't actually have as their stated conclusion that at least one God is real. No, instead their conclusion is more limited, namely that theism is significantly evidentially confirmed by some data, like moral knowledge or fine-tuning or consciousness or psychophysical harmony or beauty, etc. That doesn't establish theism, since the relevant data also significantly evidentially confirms various atheistic hypotheses, as we've seen. Moreover, the best deductive theistic arguments are stage 1 of cosmological arguments, which do not conclude that at least one God exists, but rather conclude things like there's a first cause, or there's a necessary foundation for contingency, or etc. Oh, and by the way, if you, dear listener, think ontological arguments work, for instance, check out my co-authored SCP entry on ontological arguments linked in the description, check out also my ontological arguments playlist, and check out some of my published papers on my Phil Papers profile. So in light of the preceding parody argument, in my fourth response to Cameron shouldn't be taking theism seriously either. Alright, so in this video, I've defended 4 problems for Cameron's case. First, there are many arguments worth taking seriously against all versions of theism, in other words, against just generic theism. Second, limited God views face serious problems, so the rejection of them, in addition to the unlimited God of omnitheism, should be taken seriously. Third, atheistic arguments like the problem of evil, divine hiddenness, etc. can considerably decrease generic theism's probability, and this isn't changed by the fact that some versions of theism predict the data just as well as atheism. And fourth, the same quote-unquote problem that Cameron identifies equally afflicts arguments for theism, and so should also lead us not to take theism seriously if we're following Cameron's reasoning. Now, as always, if you enjoyed the video, please smash that like button like it's the skulls of your enemies. Turn on that little bell so you get notified when my videos come out, just like your mother is turned on by me. Consider supporting me on Patreon or through a one-time donation. Hey, you tip waiters who bring you extra breadsticks, and waiters get paid for what they do. I'm not getting paid, and I'm not bringing you mere breadsticks. I'm trying to help you better understand the fundamental nature of reality with caution, care, love, and philosophical rigor. So, if you tip waiters, you should also tip me. So go down there, click that little PayPal link, and extensive research that you did for this video, preparing a script that was like, 9,000 words long, etc. And just say, hey, if you appreciated that, maybe send me some money because, don't we all love money? I'm a grifter at heart. We're all grifters at heart. I'm a grifter. You're a grifter. We're all grifters. But seriously, as a grad student, someone who is not yet a philosophy professor, I do at least partly rely on patron and one-time donation income for important things. So I really do appreciate it, and much love to all my existing patrons. And hey, even if you can't afford to support me on Patreon, you can at least consider sharing the video with your friends, your coworkers, your philosophy teachers, your professors, and even your pet gerbil. Lastly, what better way to end is there than I'm Joe Schmid, this is The Majesty of Reason, and peace out.